Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm conscious about the time, so I will try and keep a relatively high pace to this presentation. So in this session, I want to look at what's going on in the rest of the world. And I really wanted to start with what's happening in the UAE and how the approach to facade design works in the UAE currently. And I think it's a really good benchmark in the design process. So we'll touch on that. We also want to look at how Australia responded to its facade challenges, primarily on its existing stock of buildings, and why I think some of the work that they did on their studies there is a good strategy to take going forward. And then ultimately, it's important to cover the UK, particularly after the challenge of Grenfell, and how they're responding to that particular disaster with a cultural change. And then just at the very end, kind of a summary few thoughts about how consultants should be thinking moving forward. So the UAE code, I call it a good benchmark. I'm sure a lot of people on this call will be very familiar with the document itself. I particularly quite like it when it comes to facade designs. But fundamentally, what I really like about the document is it really pinpointed some key areas of concern related to facade fire safety, which are the 5 points you can see on the screen here. The first one being the combustibility of insulations and potential composite panels. Some of the poor facade panel quality in the bonding. So occasionally where the bonding wasn't sufficient and it would expose the internal combustible core, which again could contribute to the fire load on the building. It's also pinpointed some cases of untested products and assemblies being used. And a particular aspect of mine is the poor quality of workmanship. And I spent the best part of 6 months on a construction site looking around buildings. And I really was exposed to the two extremes of workmanship. I saw some very good examples of items like slab edge fire stopping, but equally I saw some really, really poor examples. And the other thing that it's pinpointed is often we have a lack of breaks within facade systems. So we have these enormous cavities which can help fire spread very rapidly. So really it's pinpointed these 5 items to address. It's largely quite a prescriptive approach to facade designs, but it does give clearly defined use of standards and facade systems and gives a benchmark for which people should be looking to adopt. So some of the key areas of focus in the code itself, it does look at the correct use of materials, so making sure that materials being used individually are tested to be considered low combustibility, for example, A1 or A2 under the BSEN 13501 test. And ensure that new systems, so when we have all these individual products coming together, that the systems are actually tested as an assembly. So that might happen under a test such as the NFPA 285 test. So something that the UA code is actually quite unique in is the adoption of spandrel panels. So these fire-resistant barriers to help try and limit fire growth and fire spread up the facade of a building from floor to floor. And in other parts of the world, spandrel panels are noted in design codes, but are often allowed to be negated on the basis of sprinkler protection. And that's not necessarily the case under the UAE fire code. And what another aspect I really particularly like about the UAE code is there's a real focus on roles and responsibilities of all parts of the design team. And I think it's something which Anam picked up on in his presentation earlier quite well. But it really does bring all the different parties and stakeholders in the building process together, whether it's the fire engineer, the facade consultant, the contractor, the manufacturer. And they come together and produce method statements and undertaking letters and warranties. And equally on the product side, it starts asking for the products to be brought to site with clear labeling, how the product should be stored when their expiry dates are expected to be. And something which I really like about this process is it creates these clear lines of traceability and accountability. And if anything was to ever go wrong in the future, at least we have a clear layer of information of how certain things were installed. I won't touch too much on the inspections of 20% intervals. I know Anam's just talked about that in his presentation. But something which I think is important is the code does want to see evidence of certification or qualifications of people who are installing and inspecting facade systems. And I think that's a really important aspect to pick up on, is that we need to have confidence that what is being installed on site is being installed by competent people in line with the tested manufacturer's details. The code also talks about some of the smaller minutiae of facade systems. It does acknowledge items like membranes, and it notes that they are necessary. And it asks for the systems to try and achieve a Class A level of performance, which is generally considered the better level of performance. It does also address the even smaller aspects of the facade, so the rubber gaskets and sealants. And it recognizes that they're inherently going to be relatively low in volume and quantity, and they can be provided in line with a Class C level. So that's the UAE. Again, I think it's a good benchmark as a design code. Moving on to Australia, and more specifically to the state of Victoria within Australia, and how they've responded to their facade challenges, primarily in their existing stock of buildings. And Australia probably had a bit of a head start on facade fires. And this was driven by a fairly significant fire in 2014 known as the La Crosse fire. And this was a fairly substantial facade-related fire where the aluminium composite panels were involved in the fire. The immediate aftermath of the fire caused a level of uncertainty to residents in other high-rise buildings in the area. And consequently, the Victorian authorities began an investigation to understand how many of the buildings in the States were potentially at risk. During this process, we had Grenfell happen in 2017. And obviously such was the alarm of the Grenfell Tower fire that the national government in Australia decided to undertake a full-scale appreciation of how many buildings there are at risk. They then devolved this power down to, or this analysis down to the different states. And in July 2017, the Victorian Cladding Task Force was set up. And their remit was to understand the number of buildings that are potentially at risk and form a way of trying to resolve or rectify the risks to these buildings. And this analysis really focused on in what we term in fire engineering as our high-risk buildings. So these would be sleeping risks over 3 stories, and healthcare and educational buildings. So really the buildings which are where occupants are less responsive to fire and potentially need assistance to evacuate. So the task force created a methodology on how they would review the buildings, and they didn't want to rely on individual building owners providing a statement of what was or wasn't in the building. They wanted to undertake a proactive approach to send building inspectors around buildings and to understand what the cladding was, what the features of the building were, and what the package of fire protection measures were within the building. So this became devolved to building inspectors who would undertake these reports. These reports would then be passed back to an independent expert panel, and this panel would look to try and assess the risks to the building based on the information within these reports. And crucially, and I think this is something which I think is a really good idea, is this expert panel was made up of not just one person, but multiple people. And typically it would be a fire engineer, a building surveyor, and a member of the local fire service. And this panel would review the information, and they would establish if the building was potentially at an extreme risk being that potentially occupants of the building need to be evacuated immediately, or potentially a lower level of risk, which they would term high risk, which would mean that remedial actions would need to happen to the building very quickly. And those might be banning the use of barbecues on balconies, removing elements of combustible facade, changing the fire alarm or enhancing the fire alarm system, or potentially moving cars away from proximity of the building to reduce potential ignition sources. And the task force really had a real focus on identifying buildings at risk and going back to the owners to be able to get them to demonstrate why they should not be rectifying the facade system. So the task force undertook analysis of about 2,200 buildings. Half of those were found to have combustible cladding. And the two key cladding products of concern were aluminium composite panels and expanded polystyrene. But the other thing which the task force found with the reviews was that what they termed essential safety measures were often ignored or not fully adhered to. And these measures might be on how often the sprinkler system or the fire alarm systems are maintained and serviced, potential fire doors being propped open rather than left closed. So it identified it wasn't just facade challenges in particular buildings, it was a much greater challenge. And the other aspects that the task force really established was to try and get facades rectified is an extremely challenging and time-consuming process. It's not fast. There's a lot of stakeholders and there's a lot of interested parties who have views on what should or shouldn't be done. But equally, the task force really established that there is a lack of funds in place generally to undertake rectification works. And from this aspect, the Victorian Cladding Task Force report, it really wanted there to be greater government intervention and government funding to try and help push the progressive rectification of buildings which are considered high risk. So very quickly, just to go through some of the stuff on the UK, and I think Craig might even touch on these in the following presentation. But of course, Grenfell, which happened in 2017, was a significant wake-up call to everyone in the industry. And it wasn't just for fire consultants or facade consultants. It really was a wake-up call to every part of the construction industry. But such was the tragedy that a report or a commission was set up to try and understand what was going wrong in the construction sector and also what was going well. And this became known as the Hackett Report. And the Hackett Report really went into detail about some of the practices within the construction industry. And it did have some pretty damning words and assumptions and summaries that were presented. Words like ignorance, indifference, a lack of clarity over roles and responsibilities, and a lack of oversight in pretty much all aspects of the construction trail from design through to actual insight implementation. And I think something which was quite revealing was it really came to the conclusion that there needs to be a cultural change in the industry. And it was a fact of moving the industry towards a case of absolute excellence wherever it can achieve it. So more recently in the UK, there has been a change to a ban on the use of combustible materials on facades in high-rise and high-risk buildings. There has been updates to its what we would term deemed to satisfy building codes and documents, primarily approved document B. And then the industry itself has had a greater focus on non-fire or non-facade related aspects of design too. So these would be items such as reviewing the adequacy of fire stopping in a compartment wall, the adequacy of a smoke control system, the design and the installation and the certification of door sets. So I think that this cultural change in the UK industry has really started to happen. So a kind of a summary slide here, and I know there's a lot of words on this particular slide, so I will go through it quite quickly. But something which I think is important from a consultancy perspective is to create the consultant mindset. And a lot of this is factored on how we're going to give the expert advice that we are commissioned to do, and how we're going to convey it clearly and simply so that everyone who understands our information can implement it effectively. I think questions which we need to ask ourselves as consultants on every project as well is whether our advice remains current and relevant to our particular project, and make sure that it's not simply a case of we've done this before in another scheme, because that may not actually be relevant to our current project. I think it's important that we emphasize the fact that a code or a standard is a minimum expectation, a minimum benchmark, if you like. But we always need to ask the question of, is that suitable or is that sufficient for our particular project? Do we need to even go further than the minimum expectation of a code? And I think I'll probably leave it on the last bullet point of, as a consultant, I think it's always important to ensure that we have suitable experience and expertise, and to really ask ourselves the questions: do we have all aspects of design covered, or do we potentially need to engage other professionals to help us with, for example, fire testing, or contractors to come on board and to help us to appreciate how they may install new facade systems. So I think it's always important as a consultant to bear this in mind. So on that basis, I think I'll head back to you, Rob.